was fascinating to watch as the Brentford social media accounts managed to both provoke and impress in one fell swoop when unveiling their kit. On one hand, they were getting tons and tons of praise for launching a 2-year home kit. Most clubs do just one per season, obviously. Brentford have been doing this for a while, actually. And they sort of talked about the fact that they wanted it to be sustainable and it's good for the environment, but also it's helpful in a cost of living crisis. And then a lot of people noticed that after losing Ivan Toney to gambling-related offences, their striker being diagnosed with a gambling addiction, it was odd that they still had Hollywood bets on their jerseys. I mean, the truth is, Simon, that the deal was done well before the Toney episode with the company for 2 years. But should Ivan Toney now be given special dispensation not to wear that shirt when he comes back?
I suppose he could be given special dispensation not to play for Brentford, given the fact that the owner of the football club made his money out of betting.
Which you wouldn't know when he signed.
Where do you want to go with this? Well, of course you would. I mean, that's Matthew Benham's field. That's what he does. He's a spread better. That's where he's made his money. So I guess he won't be signing for Brighton because Tony Bloom made his money from that as well. Bottom line is, I wonder if Ivan Toney will even be at Brentford when he comes back.
But he doesn't play for the gambling company, does he? He plays for Brentford, the football club.
And if he wore IKEA on his shirt, he wouldn't buy a load of furniture either. The fact that Ivan Toney ultimately committed most of these offences prior to signing for Brentford, and ultimately chose to go down a certain pathway of not admitting them, misrepresenting what he did, and having problems as a result of it, are really very little to do with what's on Brentford's shirt.
But do you not think that, bearing in mind they made a massive play of the fact that he was a gambling addict? And
Who did?
Well, Thomas Frank talked about it, and the fact that if he has got a gambling addiction...
No, he made a massive play of it. He made a massive play out of it, and it was one of the factors that were considered. Well, if they knew he was a massive gambling addict, I'd like to know what they did during the course of the last couple of years then, whilst this case was being brought from the FA, i.e. this time last year. Or
he was only diagnosed with it recently, wasn't he?
What? Right.
Being a gambling addict.
Right, so he was... I have to say I'm rather cynical about the nature of what got him out from underneath some of the charges. And who am I to talk about addiction? If someone's addicted and they say they are, then I guess we have to take things at face value, right? And if there was a huge concern about Ivan Toney and it was not knowledge that was privy to them, then that's one thing. If it was knowledge that was privy to them, and then ultimately what did they do to help the situation? What he was talking about specifically, Thomas Frank, was the nature of doesn't football owe him a duty of care to not ostracise him for a period of time and allow him to train and to be with the football team. Well, I understand what your point of view is, but the fact of the matter is that if you don't put people into play with serious consequences for their behaviour, then the effect of stopping people from doing it, because it wasn't a secret, Ivan Toney, as much as I like him and like his dad, knew precisely what he was doing was wrong, and so you need to make the punishment commensurate to the deterrent that you're trying to achieve in other people's minds.
Am I missing a trick here? Are we saying that the name on the shirt's going to trigger him into gambling more?
No, I think a lot of people reacted yesterday as the sort of irony of sort of suggesting that they were making a big play about the fact that they were helping everybody out by giving this new football kit, which was available for 2 years instead of one, and yet at the same time they were getting a lot of brickbats from the fact that there was still a gambling sponsor on the front of their jersey when they've lost a striker to a gambling addiction.
I get that, but if
the suggestion being what they could have done could have just got themselves out of contract.
But if the gambling firm are paying more, twice or double, treble, quadruple more than anybody else to put the name on the shirt, that then transfers to the players' wages and helps the income of the club, and therefore, so what are the players going to do? Well, okay, we'll take less money because of him.
They've got a contract, and there's no reason for that contract to be released. If the betting company want to say to them, you can come out of this contract, then that's one thing. Football's made its decision that it's going to reduce the betting influence on shirts. I firmly believe that there is a greater responsibility on the government to legislate properly the betting industry rather than necessarily look at the manner in which it represents itself. And the reasons why I say that is because you go to every poor town in this country and you'll see a betting shop on every single corner, because there's an element of cynicism about that. The societal demographics tell you that certain parts of society gamble more, in the same way there's off licenses in certain parts of towns that are slightly less financially well funded, and because of the societal life choices that people make in that economic bracket, right? Now, in this instance, if the government did their job and regulated both the overseas companies with proper legislation to stop people getting themselves into a situation where they can lose fortunes, lose their mental well-being as a result of their inability to be able to control the digital phishing that they're given that goes into their weak spots and constantly reminds them of what they could and shouldn't be able to do with betting and finds the motivation for what they did last time round and hits you with it again. If all of that stuff and credit limits were defined and betting companies were forced to communicate between one another so people can't go beyond their means, then you'd be less in a situation where the sport needed to react to saying, right, we're going to close that advertising revenue down. I know the statistics for alcohol, and I know the statistics for cigarette smoking, and all of these things are cases that prove the point that if you take the mainstream advertising out of it, you will have an element of a reduction in the participation of that. We still have a drinking culture in this country. Maybe people drink less. Maybe that's because of cost of living crisis. We'd have less people smoking in this country, but that's because people are more aware of the health damages as a result of smoking than they were previously, than necessarily banning smoking advertising, because it hasn't stopped people walking up to cigarette counters and buying packets off a shelf with burnt out lungs and death and skull and crossbones put on it. So I do think it's an unfair burden put on the sport. The argument of Danny's argument, which I do agree with, but it's kind of lost its way in the great scheme of things of how much money clubs generate, that ultimately, if the players are prepared to take less money, then we'll take different advertising routes to do it.
Well, my point was also to try and protect the minority.
No, you're
Look,
right.
I've been involved in addiction with all sorts. I used to gamble a lot and many other things that I've talked about on here, but ultimately, I'm the minority, you're the minority. And the fact is that Simon's spot on with the government and the way they allow what the agents betting companies do. But for one player to think that I know the rules have come in now, but for Brentford as a football club to remove that income because to protect one player's feelings, come on.
It's just a producer putting a clever, divisive question in to make it into something that probably isn't likely to be commercial reality.
He's not going to go into training. Next time he goes into training, puts his Brentford kit on, he's not going to think.
Yeah, and he's going to run around the ground with all the advertising holding, because that's what someone was saying yesterday from one of the from the NHS that I'm doing a campaign to look at the fact. They said, well, if you're going to take it off shirts, you've got to take it off all the advertising holding around the grounds, because that legislation hasn't been passed.
Well, he actually gave some stats regarding what he felt was more. I don't know how he got the stats from, but the sponsorships on the shirts are much less effective than the advertising boards around the pitch.
Well, and you've got the main broadcaster in English football broadcasting with an endless diatribe of bet on their
Sky Bet.
Well, it's something that football's trying to rationalise itself with, because the amount of revenue that it gets from it, and also the sheer number of people that are sports that rely on gambling. I mean, horse racing, for example, is a sport that absolutely. But
it's more to do with the digital. Listen, going to the tote and betting in the way that you do at a horse racing event has a very different connotation than the drive to subscribe, which takes you from in-game betting to online casino. And all of that stuff, that's where the handoff is becoming problematic, and people are finding themselves into economic. Now, I'm in the camp that individual responsibility has to be at the front of it, but also the industry should be forced by legislation to control what damage people choose to do to their economics. And that means there needs to be communication between betting companies. It means that you can't have credit, you can't have an ability to spend more money than the credit check they put you through to go on their platform allows. And of course, what they'll argue is it's the gateway. It's the gateway for the next generation of gamblers and young people accepting gambling as part of society, and then being influenced gotten early, like the old nicotine commercials back in the day when you'd induce people into smoking. That's the argument that the anti-gambling community will make, and it's a valid one. But it's incumbent upon legislation.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.